Peter has talked a little bit about Dickens's reading the Carol. When Dickens first read Christmas Carol to the public in Birmingham in the 1850s, it ran for just over 3 hours. But don't worry, carriages may be safely called for a little after 8 this evening. In fact, the edition that I'm reading from is one that was edited really from Dickens's own reading copy, but pruned away even more by Dickens's great-grandson, Cedric, whom I remember with very great affection. Peter has read some housekeeping notes, but let me read you a couple of Dickens's sort of housekeeping notes. When just before he started to read the Carol, he had 2 requests. If for the next hour you should feel disposed to give expression to any emotion, please do so with perfect freedom from restraint. Yes, exactly, like that. Second, nothing could be more in accordance with my wishes than that you should all make yourselves as much as possible like a group of friends listening to a tale told by a winter fire, and forget all ceremonies and form in the manner of your coming together. I mean, that's really what the Christmas Carol comes from, that tradition of reading a ghost story around the fireside on Christmas Eve. So with a bit of imagination, perhaps we can conjure something of that. Anyway, A Christmas Carol in Prose, being a ghost story of Christmas. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew that he was dead, but of course he did. How could it be otherwise? He and Marley were partners for, I don't know how many years. But there is no doubt that Marley was dead. And this must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate tonight. I mean, if we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll on his ramparts at night than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. Here it stood years afterwards above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge and sometimes Marley. But he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheeks, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day. and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighbouring offices like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole and was so dense without that although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with a shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter, tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of a strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God bless you!" Humbug. "Oh, Christmas a humbug, Uncle. You don't mean that, I'm sure." The voice of Scrooge's nephew again. "I do. Merry Christmas. Out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer? If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart, he should." "Oh, Uncle." "Nephew, you keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine." "Keep it? But you don't keep it." Well, let me leave it alone then." "Oh, don't be angry, Uncle. Come. Dine with us tomorrow, Christmas Day." Scrooge said that he would see him. Oh, yes, indeed, he did. He went the whole length of that expression and said that he would see him in that extremity first. "But why, Uncle, why?" "Why did you get married?" "Well, because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love? Oh, good afternoon. I'm sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute, Uncle. So a Merry Christmas anyway. Good afternoon. And a Happy New Year. Good afternoon." He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. "There's another fellow, my clerk, with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I shall retire to Bedlam." The clerk, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let two other people in. These were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands and bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago, this very night." "Ah, well, at this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at the present time." "Are there no prisons?" "Oh, plenty of prisons." "And the union workhouses, are they still in operation?" "Well, they are, but under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, a few of us are endeavouring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices." What may I put you down for?
Nothing.
You wish to be anonymous.
I wish to be left alone. Since you asked me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the prisons and the workhouses. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Well, many can't go there, and many would rather die. Well, if they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentlemen withdrew. Oh, foggier yet, and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. The owner of one scant young nose stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of "God bless you, merry gentlemen, let nothing to you dismay," Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. At length, the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool.
Yeah, you'll want all day off tomorrow, I suppose?
If quite convenient, sir.
It's not convenient and it's not fair. If I were to stop £0.50 for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound.
The clerk observed that it was only once a year.
A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. But I suppose you must have the whole day. I'll be here all the earlier next morning.
The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms up a lowering pile of building in a yard where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing hide-and-seek with other houses, and have forgotten the way out again. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during the whole time of his residence there. Also, that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London. And yet Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the door knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face, with a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster phosphorescing in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up upon its ghostly forehead. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a door knocker again. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. A small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and a little saucepan of gruel upon the hob. Scrooge had a cold in the head. Nobody under the bed. Nobody in his closet. nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Thus, secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the corner of the room for some purpose now forgotten and connected with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and a strange, inexplicable kind of dread that as he watched, this bell began to swing. Soon it rang out loudly, and so did all the bells in the house. The bells ceased as they had begun together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards the door, and then without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. The same face. The very same. Marley, with his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind.
How now? What do you want with me?
Much. Marley's voice, no doubt about it.
Who or what are you?
Ask me who I was.
Well, who were you then? You're very particular for a shade.
In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley. I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link, yard by yard. Is its pattern strange to you? Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing.
Oh, Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob.
I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer. You will be visited by 3 spirits.
Oh, is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? I think I'd rather not.
Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that for your sake you remember what has passed between us. The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. The spectre floated out through the opened window into the deep, dark night. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, as he had locked it with his own hands. He tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable. And being from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed without undressing and fell asleep upon the instant. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of the chamber. Suddenly, the church clock tolled a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them. It was a strange figure. It was like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view, being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle on it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin.
Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold me?
I am.
Who and what are you?
I am the ghost of Christmas past.
Long past?
Said Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish stature. No, your past. The things that you will see with me are shadows of the things that have been. They will have no consciousness of us. Rise and walk with me. As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood on an open country road, with snow upon the ground. Oh, good heaven! I was bred in this place. I was a boy here. You recollect the way? Remember it? I could walk it blindfold. They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge and church and winding river and school. The school is not quite deserted. A solitary child is left there still. Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. At one of these desks, a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor, forgotten self as he had used to be.
Poor boy. I wish... it's too late.
What is the matter?
Nothing. There was a boy singing a carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something. That's all.
Although they had but that moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it.
Know it? I was apprenticed here.
They went in. At sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig sitting behind such a high desk that if he'd been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling, Scrooge cried in great excitement,
"Why, it's old Fezziwig. Oh, it's Fezziwig alive again, bless his heart."
Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7.
"Oh, there, Ebenezer! Dick, come here."
Scrooge's former self came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice.
Yo-ho, my boys. No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Now, let's have the shutters up before a man can say Jack Robinson. Clear away, my lads. Let's have lots of room here.
It was done in a minute. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came the 6 young men and women employed in the business. And away they all went, 20 couple at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old top couple always turning up in the wrong place, new top couple starting off again as soon as they got there, all top couples at last and not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done, well done!" And the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter until it positively hissed. There were more dances, and there were forfeits, and there were more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, and a great piece of cold roast, and a great piece of cold boiled. But the great effect of the evening came when the fiddler struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't predict what would come of them next. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone all through the dance, advance and retire, hold hands with your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back again to your place, Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished them a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the 2 prentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop. A small matter to make these silly folk so full of gratitude, is it not? He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3, 4, perhaps. Is that so much?
No, it isn't that, Spirit. It isn't that. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil.
He felt the Spirit's glance and stopped. What is the matter?
Nothing particular.
Something, I think.
No. I should just like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now. That's all.
His former self turned down the lamps as he gave utterance to the wish, and Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air.
Oh, Spirit, leave me. Take me back. Haunt me no longer.
As he struggled with the Spirit, he was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by irresistible drowsiness, and further, of being in his own bedroom, and had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. When the bell struck 1, Scrooge lay upon his bed, the very core and centre of a blaze of ruddy light which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour. He got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name. He obeyed. It was his own room, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. Heaped up upon the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with a delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up, high up, to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. Come in, and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple deep green robe, bordered with white fur. "You have never seen the like of me before." Never. Spirit, conduct me where you will. If you have anything to teach me, let me profit by it." "Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There were great round, pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at the doors and tumbling out into the street in their apoplectic opulence. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars. There were pears and apples clustered high in blooming pyramids, bunches of grapes made in the shopkeeper's benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance ancient walks among the woods and pleasant shufflings ankle-deep through withered leaves. The grocers, nearly closed with perhaps 2 shutters down or 1, but through those gaps, such glimpses. The customers were all so hurried and so eager that they tumbled up against each other. When there were angry words between some who had jostled with each other, the Spirit shed a few drops of water on them from his torch, and their good humor was restored directly. And perhaps it was the pleasure the good Spirit had in showing off this power of his, and his sympathy with all poor men, that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks. For there he went, and took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe, and on the threshold of the door, the Spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. Then, inside, up rose Mrs. Cratchit, and she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming at outside the bakers they'd smelt the goose and known it for their own. And basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he blew the fire until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked against the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. In came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim. He had his limbs supported by an iron frame. The 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off to the wash-house that he might hear the puddings singing in the copper. Soon they returned, and Tiny Tim took his stool beside the fire. And now Bob, turning up his cuffs, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits then went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. At last, dishes were set on. Grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it into the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all around the board. Oh, there never was such a goose! Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavour, its size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witnesses, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it, a supposition at which the two young Cratchits were furious. Hello? A good deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day? That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house, and a pastry cook's next door to that, and a laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, what a wonderful pudding! Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he considered it the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. At last, dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept and the fire made up, the compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the fire, while Bob served out the punch with beaming looks, and the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Bob then proposed, "Merry Christmas to us all, my dears," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. Spirit, tell me if Tiny Tim will live. I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. Oh, no, 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 kind spirit. Oh, what then? If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the Spirit. Man, if man you be in heart, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. It may be that in the sight of heaven you are less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. And the family faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting. Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially upon Tiny Tim, until the last. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. Then, looking at the Spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that its hair was grey. Are Spirit's lives so short? My life upon this globe ends tonight at midnight. As they stood together in an open space, the bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. Am I in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come? The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand. Ghost of the future, I fear you more than any spectre I have seen, but I know your purpose is to do me good. Lead on. They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city rather seemed to spring up about them. But there they were, in the heart of it, on change among the merchants. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. No, said a great fat man with a monstrous chin. I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead. Well, when did he die? Last night, I believe. What's he done with his money? I haven't heard. He hasn't left it to me. That's all I know. Scrooge was surprised that the spirit should attach importance to conversations apparently so trivial. They could scarcely have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was past, and this ghost's province was the future. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes. The scene changed, and now he almost touched a bed, a bare, uncurtained bed, on which, beneath a ragged sheet, there lay a something covered up, which, though it was dumb, announced itself in awful language. A cat was tearing at the door. There was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. Speed, this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me, let us go. The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children, all but one, seated round the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were now as still as statues in one corner. Mother and daughter were busy with needlework. Then Bob Cratchit was heard at the door, and his wife hurried out to meet him. You went to see it then today, Robert? Yes, my dear. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child. My little child. Spectre, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. The phantom gave no answer, but led him to a churchyard. Here, then, the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. All that you have shown me,
Are these the shadows of the things that will be? Or are they shadows of the things that may be only?
Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name. Ebenezer Scrooge. Am I that man who lay upon the bed? Oh, no, no, Spirit, no. I will not be that man. Why show me all this if I'm past all hope? I will honour Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. Holding up his hands in one last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrank, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Yes, the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven and the Christmas time be praised for this. His hands were busy with his garments all this time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them. Oh, I don't know what to do. I'm as light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I'm as giddy as a drunken man. Oh, Merry Christmas to all the world. A Happy New Year. He was checked in his transports by the churches, ringing out the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, bright, shining, golden sunlight. He called down to a boy in Sunday clothes below. What's today? Today? Why, it's Christmas Day. Oh, it's Christmas Day? I haven't missed it. Spirits have done it all in one night. Oh, they can do anything they like, of course they can. Hello, my fine fellow. Do you know the poulterers in the next street but one, on the corner? Well, I should hope I did. Oh, remarkable boy, intelligent boy. Hey, do you know if they've sold the prize turkey? Not the little prize turkey, I mean the big one. It's hanging there now. Is it? Well, go and buy it. Yes, I'm in earnest. Go and buy it. Bring them here so that I can give them direction where to take it. Hey, bring it back in 5 minutes and I'll give you half a crown. I shall send it to Bob Cratchit. You shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. It was a turkey. He never could have stood upon his legs, that bird. He would have snapped them off short in a minute, like sticks of sealing wax. Scrooge dressed himself all in his best and at last got out into the streets. He had not gone far when, coming on towards him, he beheld the portly gentleman who'd walked into his counting house the day before. My dear sir, how do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. Very kind of you. Merry Christmas, sir. Mr. Scrooge. Yes, that is my name, and I fear it may not be very pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon, and will you have the goodness to... Lord bless me. My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious? If you please, not a farthing less. Great many back payments are included in it. Would you do me that favour? He went to church and walked about the streets. In the afternoon, he turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock, but he made a dash and did it. Is your master at home, my dear? Said Scrooge to the girl. Yes, sir. He's in the dining room at a party, sir. I'll show you upstairs, if you please.
No, thank you. I'll go in here, my dear. Fred?
Well, bless my soul. Who's that?
It's I. It's your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner, Fred. Will you let me in?
Let him in? It's a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could only be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late, that was what he had set his heart on. And he did it. Yes, he did. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1:15. No Bob. He was full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. His hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock.
Hello? What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?
Oh, very sorry, sir. I am behind my time.
You are? What do you think you are? Step this way, if you please, sir.
It's only once a year, sir. It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir.
Now, I'll tell you what, my friend. I'm not going to stand this sort of thing any longer. And therefore,
Scrooge continued, leaping from his stool and giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again.
And therefore, I am about to raise your salary.
Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him, and calling to the people in the court for help and a straight waistcoat.
A Merry Christmas, Bob. A merrier Christmas, Bob, than I've given you for many a year. I will raise your salary, yes. And we'll discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking Bishop Bob. Now, come on, now, make up the fires, Bob, and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew. Some people laughed to see the change in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived in that respect upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed that knowledge. May that be truly said of us and of all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone.